The morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen expanse of Lake Pabas, its pale light reflecting off the ice like scattered diamonds. Prince Alexander Nevsky stood at the eastern shore, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter April air of 12. Behind him, the assembled forces of Novgorod and Vladimir Suzdal waited in grim silence, their weapons gleaming with frost. The prince's dark eyes surveyed the vast frozen lake that stretched before them, knowing that this icy battlefield would soon be stained with blood. For months, the Teutonic Knights and their allies from the Livonian Order had pushed deeper into Russian territory, their ironclad cavalry crushing all resistance. These warrior monks, sworn to spread Christianity at sword point, had already seized Pskov and threatened the very heart of Orthodox Russia. Their leader Hermann von Buxtehude, Bishop of Dorpat, commanded a formidable force of German knights, Danish crusaders, and Estonian auxiliaries. The Western invaders believed their superior armor and tactics would easily overcome the barbarian Russians. Alexander Nevsky had deliberately chosen this ground. The frozen lake, though treacherous, would serve his purposes well. The ice was thick enough to support infantry and light cavalry, but the weight of heavily armored knights and their destriers would prove problematic. Ravens circled overhead, as if sensing the coming carnage. The local fishermen called this place Raven's Rock, and it would soon earn a darker reputation. The prince's tactical brilliance had already been demonstrated at the Battle of the Neva 2 years earlier, where he had earned his surname by defeating the Swedes. Now, at age 22, he faced his greatest challenge. The survival of Russian independence hung in the balance. Behind him, Orthodox priests offered final blessings to the soldiers, their voices carrying across the frozen wasteland. The banner of Novgorod fluttered in the harsh wind, its golden threads catching the light. As the morning progressed, scouts reported the approach of the Crusader army. The thunder of hooves echoed across the frozen landscape as hundreds of knights in full mail advanced toward the lake. Their polished armor reflected the sun like a moving wall of steel. Banners bearing the Black Cross of the Teutonic Order snapped in the wind, accompanied by the standards of various German principalities. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Nevsky had positioned his forces in a crescent formation along the eastern shore, with the lake at their backs. To untrained eyes, it might have seemed like a tactical mistake, but the prince knew better. The frozen lake would become his ally, not his enemy. As the German force drew closer, he could see the confidence in their ranks. They had crushed every Russian force they had encountered, and they expected this battle to be no different. The tension was palpable as both armies prepared for combat. The fate of Russian civilization rested on the outcome of this confrontation. Would the Orthodox East fall to the Catholic West, or would the ice of Lake Pabas witness a miracle that would echo through the ages? The stage was set for one of history's most legendary battles, where the frozen gates of eternity would open to claim the souls of the brave and the foolish alike. The Crusader army spread across the frozen lake like a steel tide, their formation a testament to decades of military precision. Hermann von Buxtehude rode at the head of his knights, his episcopal robes flowing beneath his armor, a sword in one hand and a cross in the other. The Teutonic wedge formation, known as the Pig's Head, was designed to punch through enemy lines with devastating effect. 200 heavily armored knights formed the spearhead, supported by crossbowmen and Estonian levies. According to medieval chronicles preserved in the Presidential Library of Russia, the German force numbered approximately 1,500 men, while Nevsky commanded roughly the same number. The battle that would unfold on April 5th would be remembered as the Battle on the Ice, a confrontation that would define a relationship between East and West for centuries to come. The thunder of hooves grew louder as the Crusaders approached. Each knight represented years of training and a fortune in equipment. Their mail hauberks, crafted by German smiths, were considered the finest in Europe. The destriers beneath them were bred for war, their powerful legs capable of carrying both horse and rider through the thick of battle. Behind the knights came the crossbowmen, their weapons cocked and ready, while Estonian and Livonian auxiliaries flanked the formation. Nevsky watched their approach with calculating eyes. He had studied the tactics of Western knights, understanding both their strengths and their fatal weaknesses. The German formation was formidable on solid ground, but the frozen lake would test every assumption about medieval warfare. The prince raised his hand, and his archers took position behind wooden pavesses, their arrows nocked and ready. As the distance between the armies closed, the air filled with the shouts of battle cries. The Germans roared Deus Vult, while the Russians answered with Zaruz. The sound echoed across the frozen wasteland, a primal scream that seemed to shake the very ice beneath their feet. The ravens overhead cawed in response, as if commenting on the folly of men who sought glory in the grip of winter. The first clash came as a German wedge struck the Russian center. The impact was tremendous, sending men and horses sprawling across the ice. The sound of steel on steel rang out like a deadly symphony, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and horses. The Crusaders' lances found their marks, piercing Russian shields and armor with practiced precision. For a moment, it seemed as if the German tactics would prevail once again, but Nevsky had planned for this moment. As the German wedge penetrated his center, the Russian flanks began to close like the jaws of a trap. The prince had positioned his most experienced warriors on the wings, men who had fought alongside him at the Neva and knew his methods. They struck the German flanks with coordinated precision, their axes and swords finding gaps in the Crusaders' armor. The battle's momentum began to shift as the ice itself became a factor. The weight of the heavily armored knights and their mounts began to tell on the frozen surface. Cracks appeared in the ice, creating treacherous footing for the German desperate. Meanwhile, the lighter Russian cavalry, mounted on hardy northern horses, moved with greater agility across the uncertain terrain. The lake that had seemed like a highway for the Crusaders was becoming their trap. As the fighting intensified, the careful formations of both armies began to dissolve into a chaotic melee. Individual acts of heroism and desperation played out across the frozen battlefield. The fate of nations hung in the balance as steel met steel in the icy grip of eternity. The battle raged with unprecedented fury as the morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the blood-stained ice. What had begun as a textbook charge by the Teutonic Knights was rapidly degenerating into a desperate struggle for survival. The German wedge, which had initially punched through the Russian center, now found itself surrounded on three sides by Nevsky's carefully positioned forces. The prince himself fought in the thick of the melee, his sword carving a path through the enemy ranks. His presence inspired his men, who fought with the desperation of those defending their homeland. The Orthodox warriors knew that defeat meant not just death, but the end of their way of life. Behind them lay the cities of Novgorod and Pskov, filled with families who depended on their courage. Hermann von Buxivden, realizing that his initial assault had been contained, attempted to rally his knights for a second charge. But the ice beneath their feet was becoming increasingly treacherous. The constant movement of hundreds of men and horses, combined with the weight of their armor, had begun to compromise the frozen surface. Water started to seep through the cracks, creating a deadly mixture of ice and slush that threatened to trap the heavily burdened Crusaders. The Russian archers, positioned on the firmer ground of the eastern shore, maintained a steady rain of arrows on the German ranks. Their composite bows, designed for the harsh conditions of the northern forests, proved more reliable in the bitter cold than the crossbows of the Crusaders. Each arrow found its mark with deadly precision, striking down knights and horses alike. The German formation, once so imposing, began to waver under the constant barrage. As the battle entered its crucial phase, individual acts of valor emerged from the chaos. A young Russian warrior named Gavril Aleksik fought his way through a group of German knights to reach their banner, cutting down the standard-bearer in single combat. The fall of the Teutonic banner sent a shockwave through the Crusader ranks, while the Russians responded with renewed vigor. The tide of battle was turning decisively in favor of the defenders. The German knights, weighed down by their armor and mounted on horses bred for different terrain, found themselves at a severe disadvantage on the unstable ice. Many attempted to retreat, but the Russian cavalry had sealed off their escape routes. The lake that had seemed like a highway to conquest had become a frozen prison. The climax came when a section of ice near the center of the battlefield gave way entirely. Dozens of German knights disappeared beneath the dark waters, their heavy armor dragging them down to a watery grave. The sight sent panic through the remaining Crusaders, who began to break formation and flee in all directions. The disciplined charge of the morning had become a rout. Nevsky, sensing the moment of victory, ordered a general advance. The Russian forces swept forward like an avalanche, driving the surviving Germans back across the lake. The proud knights of the Teutonic Order, who had terrorized the borderlands for months, were now running for their lives across the treacherous ice. The battle cry of Tsar Rus echoed across the frozen wasteland as the defenders pursued their fleeing enemies. The pursuit continued for several miles, with the Russians showing no mercy to those who had invaded their homeland. By midday, the battle was over. The frozen surface of Lake Peipus was littered with the bodies of the dead and dying, their blood steaming in the cold air. The Teutonic Knights had suffered their most catastrophic defeat, losing hundreds of their finest warriors to the ice and steel of the Russian defenders. As the sun reached its zenith, casting long shadows across the battlefield, it was clear that the balance of power in the region had shifted dramatically. The Western Crusade against Orthodox Russia had been stopped cold at the frozen gates of Lake Peipus. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scale of the catastrophe that had befallen the Crusader army. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the ice of Lake Peipus bore witness to one of the most decisive defeats in medieval warfare. The bodies of German knights, Danish crusaders, and Estonian auxiliaries lay scattered across the frozen surface, their once gleaming armor now dull with blood and ice. Prince Alexander Nevsky surveyed the battlefield with grim satisfaction. The immediate threat to Russian independence had been eliminated, but he knew that the implications of this victory would resonate far beyond the borders of Novgorod and Vladimir. The myth of Teutonic invincibility had been shattered on the ice, and word of this defeat would spread throughout Europe like wildfire. The Russian casualties, while significant, were far less than those of their enemies. The prince had lost approximately 300 men, while the Crusaders had suffered nearly 1,000 dead, wounded, or captured. Among the prisoners were several high-ranking knights, including members of the Teutonic Order's inner circle. These captives would provide valuable intelligence about Western military tactics and future plans for expansion. As the Russian forces began the grim task of collecting their dead and wounded, they also gathered the spoils of victory. The armor and weapons of the fallen knights were of exceptional quality, far superior to anything the Russians could produce. Each captured sword, lance, and mail shirt represented not just military advantage, but economic wealth that could support the defense of the realm for years to come. The retreating German army left behind a trail of abandoned equipment and wounded men. Many of the fleeing knights had thrown away their heavy armor and weapons in their desperate attempt to escape across the treacherous ice. The few who survived the battle and the subsequent pursuit would carry word of the defeat back to the Teutonic strongholds, where it would be received with shock and disbelief. Hermann von Buxhoevden himself had narrowly escaped capture, fleeing westward with the remnants of his army. The bishop's dreams of converting the Orthodox Russians to Catholicism had been shattered along with his military force. The defeat at Lake Peipus would effectively end his career as a crusader leader, and he would spend his remaining years defending his existing territories rather than expanding them. The political ramifications of the battle were immediate and final. The Teutonic Order, which had seemed unstoppable in its eastward expansion, was forced to reassess its entire strategy. The defeat at Lake Peipus demonstrated that the Russians were not the easy targets they had been assumed to be. The Order would never again mount such an ambitious campaign against Orthodox Russia. For the common people of Novgorod and the surrounding regions, the victory represented more than military success. It was a vindication of their faith and their way of life. The Orthodox Church declared the battle a miracle, with some claiming that Saints Boris and Glub had appeared on the battlefield to aid the Russian forces. Whether or not divine intervention had played a role, the victory had certainly preserved the Orthodox character of Russian civilization. As night fell over the frozen lake, the survivors of both armies reflected on the day's events. The Germans who had escaped would carry the memory of their defeat for the rest of their lives, while the Russians would remember their victory as the moment when their homeland was truly born. The ice of Lake Peipus had witnessed the clash of civilizations, and the outcome would shape the future of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. The days following the battle brought both celebration and sorrow to the Russian lands. As news of the victory spread through the towns and villages of Novgorod and Vladimir, church bells rang out in thanksgiving, and the people gathered in the streets to praise their young prince. Alexander Nevsky had not only saved their homeland from conquest, but had also established himself as one of the greatest military leaders of his generation. The Orthodox Church played a crucial role in interpreting the victory for the Messiah. Priests proclaimed that God had delivered the Russians from their enemies, just as he had delivered the Israelites from the Egyptians. The battle on the ice was presented as a holy war, a conflict between the true faith and the heretical teachings of the West. This religious interpretation would have lasting effects on Russian attitudes toward Western Europe. However, the victory came at a significant cost. The families of the 300 Russian dead mourned their losses even as they celebrated the triumph. Widows and orphans faced an uncertain future in a harsh land where survival depended on the strength of men. The prince ordered that the families of the fallen be provided for from the spoils of victory, but no amount of gold could replace a husband or father. The captured German knights presented both an opportunity and a problem. According to the customs of medieval warfare, prisoners of noble birth could be ransomed for substantial sums. The wealth gained from these ransoms would help fund the reconstruction of Russian defenses and provide for the families of the dead. However, housing and feeding the prisoners through the harsh winter months would strain the resources of the Russian principalities. The psychological impact of the victory was perhaps even more significant than the material gains. For the first time in generations, the Russians had proven that they could stand against the best that Western Europe could offer. The defeat of the Teutonic Knights sent a message that would resonate throughout the medieval world. Russia was not a land to be conquered lightly. The strategic implications of the battle were profound. The Teutonic Order was forced to abandon its plans for eastward expansion and instead focus on consolidating its existing territories. The defeat at Lake Peipus marked the beginning of a long period of stagnation for the Order, which would never again pose a serious threat to Russian independence. The balance of power in the Baltic region had shifted decisively in favor of the Orthodox principalities. Alexander Nevsky himself was transformed by the victory. The young prince who had stood on the shores of Lake Peipus that April morning had become a legendary figure, a hero whose name would be remembered for centuries. The church would later canonize him as a saint, recognizing not only his military prowess, but also his role in preserving Orthodox Christianity in Russia. The battle also had important implications for the development of Russian military tactics. The victory demonstrated the effectiveness of combining traditional Russian fighting methods with careful tactical planning. The use of the natural environment as a weapon, particularly the treacherous ice of the lake, became a hallmark of Russian warfare. Future generations of Russian commanders would learn from Nevsky's example, using the harsh climate and difficult terrain to defeat invading armies. As spring approached and the ice of Lake Peipus began to thaw, the bodies of the German dead would disappear beneath the dark waters, but the memory of their defeat would endure, serving as a warning to any who might consider attacking the Russian lands. The frozen gates of eternity had claimed many souls that day, but they had also forged a nation that would endure for 1,000 years. The victory at Lake Papus was not just a military triumph. It was a defining moment in the history of Russian civilization. The prince and his people had proven that they could defend their homeland against any foe, no matter how powerful or well. The ice had been their ally, and valor had been their weapon. The spring thaw of 1242 brought with it a final, grim reminder of the battle's cost. As the ice of Lake Papus began to crack and shift, the bodies of the fallen German knights rose to the surface, their armor still gleaming despite months beneath the frozen waters. Local fishermen would find pieces of equipment and human remains for years to come, each discovery serving as a stark reminder of the day when the Crusaders met their doom on the frozen lake. The political landscape of Eastern Europe was forever changed by the events of that April morning. The Teutonic Order, once the scourge of the Baltic region, was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty with Norway. The terms were harsh but fair. The order would abandon all claims to Russian territory and pay substantial reparations for the damage caused by their invasion. More importantly, they would never again attempt to convert the Orthodox population to Catholicism by force. The victory at Lake Papus also had profound implications for the relationship between Russia and the Mongol Empire. The Golden Horde, which had conquered much of Eastern Europe, took notice of Nevsky's military. Rather than face such a formidable opponent, the Mongols chose to make Alexander Nevsky their vassal, allowing him to rule the Russian principalities as their representative. This arrangement, while humiliating, ensured Russian survival during the darkest period of the Mongol yoke. The battle became the stuff of legend almost immediately. Within a generation, storytellers throughout Russia were recounting the tale of the young prince who had defeated the ironclad knights of the West. The story grew in the telling, with each version adding new details and embellishments. Some claimed that the ice itself had risen up to swallow the invaders, while others insisted that angels had fought alongside the Russian forces. The Orthodox Church embraced the battle as a sacred moment in Russian history. The defeat of the Catholic Crusaders was interpreted as divine validation of the Orthodox faith. Church historians would later write that the victory at Lake Papus was as important as the conversion of Vladimir the Great to Christianity 2 centuries earlier. Both events, they argued, had saved Russia from spiritual conquest by foreign powers. The military tactics employed by Nevsky at Lake Papus would influence Russian warfare for centuries to come. The use of the environment as a weapon, the importance of mobility over heavy armor, and the effectiveness of combined arms tactics became standard elements of Russian military doctrine. Future commanders, from Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great, would study the battle and apply its lessons to their own campaigns. The legacy of the battle extended far beyond military matters. The victory at Lake Papus became a symbol of Russian resistance to foreign domination, a reminder that the Russian people would never submit to conquest. This spirit of defiance would manifest itself repeatedly throughout Russian history, from the defeat of Napoleon to the resistance against Nazi Germany during World War II. Alexander Nevsky himself became more than just a military hero. He became the embodiment of Russian virtue. His canonization by the Orthodox Church in 1247 recognized not only his military achievements but also his wisdom in dealing with the Mongol threat. The prince who had saved Russia from the West while accommodating the East became a model for future Russian leaders. The battle on the ice remains one of the most famous engagements in medieval warfare, studied by military historians and celebrated by Russian patriots. The frozen lake where knights and princes fought for the soul of a nation has become a symbol of the eternal struggle between East and West, between different ways of life and different visions of the future. As the centuries passed, the physical evidence of the battle gradually disappeared. The armor and weapons corroded, the bones of the dead crumbled to dust, and the ice itself melted and refroze countless times. But the memory of that April day in 1242 remained vivid in the Russian consciousness, a reminder of the price of freedom and the power of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The clash at the frozen gates had ended, but its echo would resonate through eternity, inspiring future generations to defend their homeland with the same valor that Alexander Nevsky and his men had shown on the ice of Lake Papus. The battle was over, but the legend would live forever.